And now, please welcome Dr. Philip Rodionoff.
Jesus Christ, who is he? And why does it matter? These are very important questions, and as we know, lots of people have different opinions about who Jesus Christ is. There are some people who say he's a good man. Other people say, well, he's a prophet. Others say he's something even more. There's others who look at the world today and say, well, look, Jesus Christ isn't particularly relevant. There's other people who say he's the greatest person who ever lived, the most influential person in all of history. Well, before we examine what Jesus himself said about himself, what I want to do is address a question that many people have asked over the years, and that is Jesus actually a person of history? Did Jesus exist? Because there have been people over the years who have said, well, look, the whole notion of Jesus has just been made up. It's something that some people got together and they fabricated the idea of Jesus, and it was a myth or a legend that developed over time. So how would we investigate if Jesus indeed was a real person, is a real person? Well, we need to go and have a look at the historical sources. And that's what we'll do. See, Jesus is reported to have lived approximately 2,000 years ago. So let's have a look at what historical sources there are that would either support or not support the idea that Jesus was a figure of history. Well, the evidence actually comes from three major sources. The first is Roman historians. Clearly around that time, Rome was the ruler of the then known world. And so Roman historians would be very strong evidence for the fact that Jesus Christ existed if in fact they actually write about him. Jewish writers, Jesus is reported to have actually grown up and spent time in the area where the Jewish people lived. So if there's Jewish writers who would say something about Jesus, that also would be very strong evidence. And then, of course, we've got New Testament writers. The New Testament is the story of Jesus Christ, and the writers there claim to be eyewitnesses of all the events that they recorded. So we'll have a look what evidence they present as well. Well, let's have a look first of all at the Roman historians. Now, Tacitus has been described as the greatest of Roman historians. And interesting, this is what he says concerning Jesus. He says, Christos, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. The word Christus, and you can see there, we use the term Jesus Christ, and Christus clearly refers there, it's the way that it was said then, Christus refers to Christ, to Jesus Christ. Interesting, he goes on further, and he gives other historical material there, that he was put to death by Pontius Pilate. And then quite specifically says he was a procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. This is actually quite specific historical information that we can corroborate with other history. So just this particular historical extract tells us a lot about the fact that there was a Christ, a Christus, who actually existed there at Roman times. Well, there's another Roman historian, Plinius Secundus. And he wrote the following. He says, Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang a hymn to Christ as to a God. Another historian looking at this whole concept, clearly there were a group of believers in Jesus Christ who worshipped him, but interestingly, they sang a hymn to Christ, so the name is mentioned, as to a God. And that's quite significant, as we'll see a little bit later. Then we need to mention Josephus, Flavius Josephus, who, although a Jew, he worked for the Romans. He was a historian. In fact, he wrote quite prolifically. And there's a particular extract from his writings which deal with the person of Jesus Christ. Now, note how specific this particular information is. It says, at this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon their discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Notice here what Josephus is saying about Jesus Christ. First of all, he says he's a good man, that he was killed on a cross, that he was reported alive 3 days later, and that perhaps he was the Messiah. Many people have questioned this particular statement because it seems to be so strongly in support of not only the person of Jesus Christ, but it speaks about some of the miraculous as well. And so people have said, well, hang on, Josephus surely wouldn't have written something like that. And so that has been debated over the centuries. More recently, there have been some scholars who have looked at his writing in terms of a literary analysis and concluded that if you were to take this segment out, then it would actually do injustice to the literary flow of the work within which it appears. And so some of the more recent conclusions are saying, well, yes, it actually needs to be there as part of the structural integrity of the whole. So those three historians themselves give us very strong evidence that Jesus Christ was a man of history. But there's more. And some of the best evidence that we can have are from perhaps critics, from people who wouldn't be favourable, people who are trying to give us evidence, but rather critics there. And here we have a look at the Jewish historians, and we have a look at a passage from the Talmud. And it says, on the eve of Passover, they hanged Yeshu of Nazareth, in that he has practiced sorcery and beguiled and led astray Israel. Now, that's a very interesting passage which we'll unpack. First of all, you note there the word Yeshu. Well, the Yeshu in Hebrew is Jesus in Greek. So we are talking here about the person of Jesus. What's interesting there, they say there that he was hanged, now on a cross, just before the Passover feast. Now this is exactly as the New Testament Gospels say. So this is entirely consistent and it corroborates that account. What is interesting there also, that this person, Yeshu or Jesus, is accused of sorcery. So if you were a critic of somebody, and as we know from the Gospels, Jesus is portrayed as having performed many miracles, well, somebody who is not actually favourably disposed toward Jesus would be suggesting quite, you would think, accusing him of something, and sorcery or some kind of magic or some kind of connotation along those lines would be quite reasonable that you would expect from someone who was a critic of someone who is actually performing miracles. So this is an interesting piece of evidence from what would be considered a non-sympathetic source. But then we go to the New Testament itself, and we have a look at a passage from 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared, we have seen it, and testify to it. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you also may have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. We write this to make your joy complete. In this passage from the New Testament, there is absolutely no question that the writer here, and as we look further in the New Testament, the writer's clearly understood that Jesus Christ was a real person who lived amongst them, who they spent time with, and who they followed. What is interesting as well is the motivation for this particular writing. It's not some piece of abstract history just for the sake of our intellectual curiosity. The idea here, as it says, we tell you this, we proclaim this to you, what we have seen and heard, so that you may also have fellowship with us. And it talks about in our fellowship with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And what's that last phrase? We write this to make your joy complete. This is actually sharing good news. There is good news in who Jesus Christ is. And so the authors of the New Testament are wanting to write this down so that we too are able to come to know Jesus Christ. So I think what we can see here, just from the few passages we've seen, and there are many other passages we could have looked at, but there's no question that Jesus Christ is a real figure of history. Now, at this stage, some people may say, well, that's very good, you're citing the New Testament. But isn't that a work that is motivated by religious thoughts and religious ideas? Doesn't it have a particular bias? How can we possibly accept it as being reliable or indeed authoritative? And that's a fair question. So on what basis would we actually have a look at any piece of ancient literature and conclude this is reliable? Well, when we look at the New Testament, there are some fascinating details that emerge. First of all, the New Testament is very much grounded in history, just as we had a look at one of the earlier passages that spoke very specifically about geography and about particular people who were mentioned in history, and here people who are non-Jews, Romans, etc. This can be corroborated by history. So the New Testament is a historical document that can actually be analysed historically. And many have done that over the years and concluded that the history there, and particularly Luke as a historian, has concluded that he's one of the finest of historians. What's more, the New Testament is largely eyewitness testimony. It was written by people who were there. If you're trying to make investigation in a court of law as to if there is reliable testimony, well, guess what? The testimony that you want is eyewitness testimony. And that's what we have in the New Testament. It's not some hearsay of somebody told somebody who told somebody else. We have here very specific eyewitness testimony. These are people who lived it, these are people who experienced it, and they are sharing exactly what they have experienced. As we look at archaeology, it has corroborated many of the details that we have there in the New Testament. Now, there's another interesting point about manuscripts, manuscript evidence. First of all, much of ancient literature only has a handful of manuscripts. The New Testament, by comparison, has many thousands. In fact, there's about 25,000 different either manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts that relate to the New Testament. The next piece of ancient literature is Homer's Iliad, which has less than 1,000. And the majority of ancient writing has just a handful, in some cases just 1, 2, or 3. But we don't question the reliability of that history. But here we have the New Testament that has more documentary evidence than any other piece of ancient literature. That can give us great confidence. What's more, much of ancient literature has a great big time frame from the earliest manuscript we have and from when the events actually occurred. In many of the cases, this time span is 1,000 years or more. And indeed, this was the case with the Old Testament scriptures for many years. And so critics would look at it and say, well, hang on, how do you know that it hasn't been changed significantly from the time it was written to when we have our earliest manuscripts? And then in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and these then had manuscripts that then were 1,000 years earlier than the ones that we had before. Interestingly, when they were compared with the ones that we had, despite that there was 1,000 years of difference, they were almost identical. So the Old Testament, that's a very interesting story. Now, what about the New Testament? The New Testament, we find we don't have 1,000 years, we don't even have hundreds of years. The earliest manuscripts that we have are in the early part of the 2nd century. In fact, the earliest manuscript is the John Rylands fragment found at the University of Manchester. It's dated in the very early part of the 2nd century, barely 20 or 30 years after it was probably written. And then by the mid-2nd century, we have large parts of the book of John. And by the end of the 2nd century, we have large parts of the New Testament in manuscript evidence, very early in the piece. So what I'm saying here is that when we look at the New Testament as a document, we can have great confidence in its historical reliability. And so when it is talking about something, we can actually read it as giving us eyewitness testimony and authoritative information. And that's very significant for the next point which we want to have a look at. And that is, It's clear that Jesus existed, but what did he say about himself? It's all very nice that people can have many opinions about who he was or who he is, but I think most importantly, what does he say about himself? The critical point is that Jesus Christ claimed to be God. Now, that's a pretty amazing claim. Let's back it up by what he actually said as recorded in the New Testament. In a passage in John chapter 8, verse 58, he made the comment, he made the statement, before Abraham was born, I am. You might look at this and think, well, okay, what's the significance of that? What's the big deal in saying that? Well, if we go back to the Old Testament in the book of Exodus, at a time when God, Yahweh, appeared before Moses, when Moses asked, who are you? This is what the response was. God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you were to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Now we need to grasp the significance of that. Here we have Jesus speaking to the authorities in the New Testament, and he makes a statement, before Abraham was born, I am. And there was no question what he meant there. The listeners knew very clearly what he was speaking about. He was making the claim to be God. Why? Because that is exactly the term that God used in the Old Testament before Abraham when he called himself I am, and notice that it's capitalized. Well, let's have a look at another passage in Mark chapter 14. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming in the clouds of heaven. What a powerful statement. He's not mincing words there, is he? He's claiming that, yes, he is Christ, the Son of the Blessed One, but what's more, he's saying there will come a time when he will be sitting there at the right hand of God in the clouds of heaven. What a powerful statement. And there's a third passage I'd like to share with you, and that's found in the book of John, chapter 10, verses 30 through to 33. I and the Father are one. Again, the Jews picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus said to them, I have shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, replied the Jews, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. The hearers had no misunderstanding as to what Jesus was claiming. It was very clear that Jesus was claiming to be God, and there was no question, there was no doubt as to the claim. In fact, it was taken so seriously, they wanted to kill him for it. So Jesus claimed to be God. Now, if someone claims to be God, how do we normally respond? We actually think there's something wrong with the person. I remember when I did my psych term when I was a medical student. We met, I guess many interesting people in the psych ward, and there were one or two who, yes, claimed to be God. Now, were their claims taken seriously? No, they weren't. In fact, they were locked up in institution because for various reasons they were considered not safe to be out in the community. So when someone claims to be God, we actually have quite an interesting reaction. Most of us actually recoil and say, well, hang on, that's just crazy. The person's crazy. You know, there's something going on here, but we don't take it seriously when somebody claims to be God. So, hang on a minute. But we've got right here a claim where somebody, a person who's living on earth, claims to be God. How do we deal with that claim? If somebody claims to be God, there are three logical alternatives. Well, first of all, they're either a madman, they're a con man, or they're telling the truth. Now, how do we come up with those three logical alternatives? Well, if someone makes the claim to be God, it's either true or it's false. That's reasonable. So either they are God or they're not God. Well, if they're not God, again, there's two logical alternatives. And that is that they either know that they aren't God or they don't know that they aren't God. And that's how we come up with those three different alternatives. So if there's someone who claims to be God, but clearly they're not God, and it's false, then if they don't know that their claim is false, well, they're mad. They actually aren't in a right frame of mind because they genuinely believe they might be God or that there's something else, but it's not true. But if they believe that, then there's something not quite working right. The other one is that if they're not God, but they make the claim, but they know it's false, well, guess what? They're trying to con someone. They're actually acting in a way that they are that person or that they are God in this case, but they know that it's false. So they're trying to deceive people. Okay, they're a con man. The alternative is if they're not the madman or the con man, well, we've got the other alternative, the first one, and that is indeed that they're telling you the truth, in which case if you're making the claim to be God, well, you are God. Now, that's nice to look at these different logical possibilities, but what happens when we apply these to Jesus Christ? So the question is, the first option, was Jesus mad? Well, when we consider his biography, well, it portrays an amazing personality that inspired others. I mean, his impact on his society, but also on all of history, has been profound, such that many people consider that he's the most influential person in all of history. He was even tempered, whether he's loved or hated. Now, how difficult is that? There were many people who actually attacked him, verbally, physically, but despite all of that, he was even tempted, and what's more, he prayed for his enemies and actually loved them. He tolerated the hateful attacks. And what's more, he answered questions brilliantly. When you read the Gospels, there were questions which were the intention was to trap Jesus, to try to get him to say something that was going to give the ammunition. And you know what? When you read the answers that he gave, they were brilliant because they really dealt with the issues, but they confounded those who were trying to catch him. See, was Jesus mad? No, I don't think we conclude that at all. In fact, universally, Jesus is admired the world over. And what's more, people, even if they don't accept that he is God, accept that he was a good man, that he was a good teacher, and that he had some of the best teachings recorded anywhere in history. Certainly not a conclusion that we can possibly come to that Jesus was mad. All right, what about the next alternative? Was Jesus a con man? Well, why would he do it? We need to have a look at motivation here, possible motivation. Well, did he do it for the money? Because that's it. A lot of con men go out there and they want to do something to deceive people. Why? So they can get lots of money. Well, in this case, Jesus lived simply and he gave most of it away to the poor. He wasn't seeking the money or the riches. Was it for the power? Well, interesting, but he refused to be crowned king. There were his supporters who wanted him to be crowned king, but that wasn't what his mission was about. So he wasn't doing it for the power. Was he doing it for the popularity? This is it. People, trying to put on maybe a pretense and try to deceive people because they crave maybe fame or popularity. Well, in this case again, Jesus' enemies outnumbered his friends. And when you look at the hard sayings that he said, as recorded in the New Testament, he wasn't out there designing to make himself popular. He was out there to represent the truth and represent his Father in heaven. So as we look at the motivations that people could have for being a con man, they don't fit in with what we see of Jesus Christ. But then the question is, well, is it possible to fake it anyway? Let's say that somebody looked at all of this and thought, well, look, I want to actually try to be a con man. I want to, look, despite the fact that the motivations aren't there, that I want to try to deceive. So is it possible to fake it? Well, here it becomes incredibly difficult because in the Old Testament, there are numerous prophecies, predictions about the coming Messiah. And those predictions, they say that he's got to arrive at the right time, that he's got to be born in the right town, that he's got to be born from the right tribe, He has to be killed at the right time by a specific method. I think by this stage, anyone who's a con man is running away. Look, maybe it's okay. You can try to contrive maybe right time somehow if you just happen to understand it at the right time, right tribe, etc. But hang on a minute, there's a few things that con men probably aren't that keen on. Well, the whole idea of being killed by a specific method, well, hang on, they'd run away. It just doesn't make sense. And this is one of the grave difficulties for anyone who's trying to suggest that Jesus was a con man, because it doesn't fit in with the motivations, and it doesn't fit in with anybody possibly faking the ancient predictions or prophecies which are recorded in the Old Testament. See, there is a question, what are the chances anyway of this happening entirely by chance or randomly? It's an interesting question. In fact, there was a mathematician astronomer by the name of Peter Stoner who tried to calculate some of the probabilities of these prophecies being fulfilled entirely by chance or randomly. And so he looked at just 8 of the prophecies. Now, that's not many. In fact, there are many scholars who believe there are over 200. So 8 is just a handful, the ones that look at some of the things we've just seen, about the probability of being born at the right time, the right tribe. The killed by the right method is an interesting one as well. But looking at 8 of the basic predictions, he came up with a mathematical probability, and I should mention that he was very conservative in his figures. He came up, and that's a number with lots of zeros afterwards. So the probability that this could happen entirely by chance was, he concluded, 1 part in 10 with all those zeros afterwards. To put that number into context, it's not a dissimilar number to the number of grains of sand on the whole earth. And we're talking about the beaches, not just in Australia, not just in the United States, not in Europe, not in all the other countries. So we're looking at all the beaches, but we're looking at all the deserts as well. Imagine it, the individual grains of sand. That's just an absolutely unfathomable number. But this is what he concluded, the probability of fulfilling the 8 prophecies just by chance was like being blindfolded and dropped anywhere on the earth and picking up a particular grain of sand. It seems completely implausible. But that's just 8 of the prophecies. He went further and put his mind to looking at 48 of the prophecies. And that was the number he came up with, 1 chance with all those zeros. Those zeros, it's pretty much incomprehensible. Well over 100 of them. In fact, in the scientific realm, if there's 1 chance with 10 with 50 zeros afterwards, it's considered to be impossible. In terms of the number of atoms in the known universe, there's only 10 with approximately 80 zeros afterwards. So here we have a lot more zeros, remembering that each additional zero multiplies it tenfold. It's a factor of 10 times less likely. That's each additional zero. So 2 more zeros means it's 100 times more likely. 3 zeros is 1,000 times more likely and less likely, and so it goes on. We have an incomprehensible number there. Now, it's not only, I guess, numbers like this, but as we consider the evidence of what Jesus said about himself, about what the New Testament says, and about alternative theories, there was an academic by the name of C.S. Lewis who came up with a very interesting conclusion. Now, C.S. Lewis was a British academic at one of the top universities in the world, and he was not a believer in Jesus Christ. But then he was, as he describes it, surprised by joy. He investigated the claims of Jesus Christ, he studied the person of Jesus Christ, and yes, he became a believer, and he wrote a lot of books about faith. He also wrote some books which are very popular. You may have heard of the Narnia series, several of which have been converted into blockbuster films. So certainly someone who has made a big impact on the literary world. Well, notice what he says. He says, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit on him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. See, C.S. Lewis was in no doubt as to where the evidence led and where the logic of all this led. See, if Jesus Christ claimed to be God, that has a whole bunch of implications for who he is and what his relationship is to each one of us. But if he wasn't God, well, that just doesn't fit with the evidence. Because as we've considered, he wasn't a madman, he wasn't a con man, and we concluded he indeed is God, which is exactly the conclusion that Simon Peter came to as well, interestingly, as recorded in Matthew 16. But what about you, he asked, who do you say I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so we had Simon Peter, we had the disciples of Jesus who clearly understood who he was. They lived with him, they experienced him, they saw him die. They actually witnessed his presence after the resurrection. And so this is where the idea or the whole concept that Jesus is God is so much more than simply an intellectual exercise. And that is, if Jesus is God and Jesus died and rose from the dead and he is alive now, then the question is, where is he and what relevance does that have to us? Well, the point is, yes, he is alive. And because of that, the New Testament says that he is able to actually assist us in our daily trials and living that we have. And he is looking forward to having a relationship with each one of us, and he is offering us the gift of eternal life. See, the fact that Jesus came to earth profoundly changes everything. The fact that he lived, he died, and was resurrected changes everything. And this is exciting news. It is the good news. It is a wonderful news that gives a purpose, a meaning. It gives a destiny to which each one of us can actually be involved with. We can have that hope for the future. See, to the original question, Jesus Christ, who is he? We can give a very strong answer, a very relevant answer. And that is that he is God. But what is more significant is not only that he is God, but the fact that he is calling each one of us to follow him. And that is my prayer for each one of us, and that is that we follow him.
To help you understand God's Word in a whole new way, go to goodnewsunlimited.com. You can sign up there to get your free devotional delivered to you each day. This program has been paid for by the partners and friends of Good News Unlimited. Word spreads fast.